Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My journey to within Islam eventually took me to the United States of America. So up until now, I spoke mostly about the experience that I had in Cape Town as a Muslim, which I'll come back to, okay? But I'm sort of going about it in a linear fashion, okay? So now I had this conviction, obviously, that I wanted to be a good Muslim, a staunch Muslim. I wanted to practice Islam because I wanted to now, not because it was how I was raised. And in the midst of this, I went to live in the United States with my mother, who was an American citizen. And I was armed with a few books that I had. One was, of course, the Quran, and then I had Sahih Bukhari, and then I had these books that were basically in the genre of what I would come to know as fiqh as-sunnah. Okay, so I had some books, like for example, I had a book that was like Kitab al-Salah, the book of Salah, but it was basically a lot of hadith with brief explanations, etc., etc., everything around the Salah, from like the tahara, cleanliness, to how to perform the salah, to what salawat they are additionally to the compulsory prayers, to the various types of prayers, salatul istisqa, and the prayer for rain, and the prayer of the lunar and solar eclipse, and all these auxiliary, the kinds of things you don't ordinarily know as a Muslim, okay? So, the prayer, the how to perform the prayer when there's fear, for example, in the case of an army, and all these kinds of wonderful things. Anyway, so I had like a few books with me, and I set out to, and I read these books profusely as a 14-year-old. I was about 14, and I was reading these books quite a lot, because I was very serious. I was very incredibly serious-minded as a kid, okay? So I read these books profusely. I taught myself, aside from the Arabic my father had taught me, I taught myself more Arabic. I went through a book called Kapla Watsky. It's an Arabic series. So I went through part 1 and part 2 of that. So I taught myself Arabic. I taught myself to understand the Quran in Arabic already at that time. And it wasn't that difficult. I mean, what you do, just FYI, if you're trying to learn Arabic, for the purpose of understanding the Quran and the Hadith, what you do is you learn some basic Arabic grammar. And when I say basic, go through the scales of the verbs, fa'ala, fa'ala, fa'alu, like the scales. And look at various words and the morphology, how they morph, and how the meanings change through the various mutations of the word within the Arabic scales, right? The 10 scales. And get the hang of that. Get the hang of basic Arabic sentence structures, and get a hang of the vocabulary that you find commonly used in religion, in the Quran, in the Hadith, in the fiqh, and read the Quran side by side with the translation, and sort of get a feel for matching how the translator understood the words, right? And read various translations, in fact, and then you get a gist of it. Quite easily you can catch on the Arabic of the Quran. And the nice thing about the Quran is that 80% of the vocabulary is basically repeated. So if you study 80% of the Quran is a handful of words actually being used. So that's the amazing thing about the Quran, obviously used in different ways. But obviously, when you get into more detail, then that's not enough. But that's a good start. Anyway, so I went through the basic process of learning, uh, teaching myself these things, and I started to read. And this was in the United States of America. And I wanted to practice on everything I read. So I didn't have methodology. Okay, when you just basically want to practice on everything you read, you don't have methodology, right? So I did that for a long time, and I went to school, and I used to pray at school. During break time, people used to sometimes stand around and watch me, and I was very, very staunch in my religion, incredibly staunch. I used to really, really take things very, very seriously. And I did experience some bigotry and hatred, of course, but that's to be expected of America, especially during that time. And because I'm talking about the late 90s, the early 2000s, okay? And I was there during 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I was in the country actually, and I was watching that in shock, that had happened. But I also experienced, and this was a pivotal point for me being in America, experiencing bigotry, experiencing a lot of anti-Islam propaganda. I did feel a sense of radicalization. And what I mean by radicalization is it did create a feeling in me that that the society, in a sense, or at least the media, was basically saying that I'm bad and I'm evil somehow just because I'm trying to be a Muslim, right? And so that did sort of create a sense of turmoil for me, and I did sort of think about things as a young man. I started to think about things in very political terms, okay? Political Islam had dawned on me at the time, because we also had a lot of Palestinians in our community, and I got a lot of exposure to the political landscape, the Arab political landscape, and the plight of the Palestinians firsthand, because I spoke to Palestinians firsthand. And then this one day, we had a march in San Francisco, and I was somewhere towards the front of the march, really. I was shouting slogans in Arabic and whatnot. You know, I was young and I was very into it. And one of the Palestinian brothers, I forgot his name, he pulled out an Israeli flag and he poured lighter fluid on it. And I was wrestling with him to take the flag away from him, because I said to him, look, if you're going to burn the Israeli flag, as much as we don't agree with Israel, if you're going to burn the Israeli flag, this is going to be on the front page, and this is going to taint sort of the whole cause. This is going to taint the whole message of the march. So that's how I felt, because I felt that what you needed to do was to try to speak to people in their own language and try to reach out to people in ways they can understand, and burning flags was not helpful. Now, I was not saying that people, I mean, I know that under American law, I don't know if it's the state law or the federal law, but people, I don't know if it's California's state law or the federal law. I don't know, because there's a difference, right? America is a federation. But I know that people do have the right to burn flags. I do know that, and I understand that people have the right to do that in America. But I felt that this would be counterintuitive. This would damage the, the, the image of those, I think, 150,000, I'm not, but a lot of people who came out to the march, most of them Muslim. It would damage the image of what these Muslim people stand for, because it's going to be used. And I think what happened was, as I was pulling the flag, he lit the flag. And for that there was a brief moment there where I basically was photographed with the burning flag. And I think that affected my life ever after. I think I was marked since then, although I was only a teenager. But the point is, and I'm putting this publicly because at this point I don't care. I'm already almost 40 years old, and whatever security risks people might have thought I was for all this time, and I have been through sometimes I had to go through some extra security measures when traveling, etc., etc., and I realized, already long ago that I was marked somehow. But I think by now people I'm all over the YouTube also, that I'm not about that life at all, in fact. So, anyway, the point is, that's was one of the experiences I had in the United States. And then I also had there was a lot of politicization and political debates that I engaged with in the Muslim, Arab and Palestinian community. And there was also a lot of troubling factors that I experienced in the United States in and amongst the Muslim communities. Now, the problem with the immigrant community, and especially the Middle Eastern and Indo-Asian, Indo-Pak regions in America, is that they try to set up a mini India, a mini Kabul, a mini Pakistan, a mini Palestine, a mini versions of their own communities in America, right? And being a South African Westerner, because I'm still a Westerner, look, I probably have more in common with Americans as a Westerner than all these other Middle Easterners, right? So, I had a good taste and feel for Western culture. I knew what it was. And I could easily fit in, and I did, in many ways, right? But I found that the Muslim community was very fractured along these cultural lines. There was like a Pakistani Muslim community, there was like an Afghani Muslim community, and I basically slot myself into the Arab Muslim community because it was the nearest to me, basically. And also, it was the only Muslim community that wasn't selling itself as an Arab Muslim community. I didn't want to be like, oh, we are the Pakistani Muslims, or we are the this or that. I wasn't any of those things. So I wanted to go with the people who were just saying that, okay, we are a Muslim community. And that happened to be like the Yasin Foundation, incidentally, not named after me. And so I participated in that community. But I also found myself often at loggerheads with some of my Palestinian friends. For example, the whole question on suicide bombing, which is allegedly controversial, but which in my opinion ought not to be controversial at all. But I had discussions with people, okay, and I don't want to mention names, but I've even had discussions with some very important people who felt that suicide bombing was completely justified as an act of war. And I asked the question that if suicide bombing were to be justified as an act of war, and let's take the suicide factor out of it, let's ignore let's ignore to begin with that it's suicide, which is in itself forbidden. What about the suicide bombing that kills innocent people, people who are non-combatants, okay? And this guy literally remarked and said that, you know what, well, the innocent will go to heaven. And I said that, well, look, it's not your prerogative to decide who should. It's not your prerogative to decide any of this. First of all, you absolutely cannot kill innocent people. So I had and again, it was again based on the Quran. Okay, it was scriptural. My whole approach was always scriptural. Okay. I said you absolutely cannot kill innocent people. Okay, so that obviously brought me into the whole debate of weapons, modern warfare, okay, bombs, and so on and so forth. And which aspect of modern war is a matter of qisas, meaning al-ayn bil-ayn, okay, an eye for an eye, and transgress against them as they transgress against you, and the many verses that talk about war in that way. And at which point is it going against the prohibition of killing non-combatants in war, especially since war is not fought the way people traditionally fought wars, okay? Obviously America has changed that, obviously. They started with this whole carpet bombing and a whole place flat, or dropping a nuclear bomb somewhere in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, that whole episode. So war is no longer fought with respect for civilians, okay? So if you're fighting an enemy who does not respect civilian life, like America, then, or if you're fighting an enemy in which the soldiers are using civilians as shields, okay, would it be justified to kill civilians in the idea of equal for equal, meaning the retaliation is equal to that of what was carried out against you? I don't have an answer to that question still, okay? And the reason why I suspended thinking about that any further, or trying to answer that question is because, like I said again, I'm pragmatic. I don't focus on things that don't affect me. I'm a non-combatant. I'm not part of any political struggle. I do not belong to any government. And I am otherwise would describe myself mostly as a pacifist, in the sense that I don't think that more fighting and more wars is the prudent way forward for the world at present, especially since wars are proportionately more devastating than the objectives that they are trying to achieve in the modern context. I don't see how war is the solution. Let's just put that, because war essentially is, in principle, a method of resolving conflict between parties who cannot agree. Okay, that's what it boils down to. So the strongest one wins the argument, essentially. Okay, now where the strongest one wins the argument and then establishes an order of peace, okay, you can say, okay, the war was justified, okay, but the idea that any war would be justified given the types of weapons we have in the modern world, is just, I have a question mark on that. So anyway, but that's just academic, that's purely academic, and let's get back to the pragmatic stuff. But I found myself debating these issues because I could not, will not, and do not agree with suicide bombing, because the objective of a war or fighting, it looks to me like, actually, is the preservation of life. and the preservation of the lives of the believers and the preservation of the way of life of the believers, meaning Islam. And so war is with that angle, right? And so if the war is being fought to win, and in as a strategy of war, okay, it is known that certain people will most definitely die and there's no chance of them surviving, but it is as a strategy of war which will give the believers the upper hand and victory. I can understand that from a combative perspective, okay, but that's not what happens in places like Palestine, where Palestinians really have no chance of winning a war against Israel logistically. And so acts of like a suicide bombing, for example, is more out of despair and as a last attempt of rebellion on behalf of the suicide bomber than as a strategic act of war to overcome a superior enemy. And so that's not obviously what's taking place, or has for over the years been taking place there. And so I just cannot see how that is congruent with the way in which the Islamic texts approach the matter, especially the Quran specifically, okay? And then obviously we have hadith about not even destroying plants and infrastructure and harming women and children, etc. So there's this, the moral war is not, I don't know how the moral war, what are the moral parameters of war in modern warfare? It's very difficult because there's always high casualties, and it's civilians and non-combatants are often the biggest casualties of war, okay? So that's was one of the issues that I came across when debating these issues, and then which was troubling. Okay, which was troubling. It made me want to do a deep dive into the issue of jihad, which is the militant resistance against an enemy. Okay, and also look at the issue of offensive war, okay, as a military strategy, and what are the guidelines on that. Not so much because obviously, I mean, I never ever saw myself as being a combatant in the modern sense of things. But because I just wanted to know who's right and who's wrong. You know, there's so much that goes on in the world, you know, and we had the likes of various terrorist organizations operating at that time. And then the Twin Tower bombings took place, and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was blamed for that. Yet there was never any proof against him, incidentally, until this day. But the point is, you wanted to know what was the position, what was the authoritative position of Islam on the conduct of war, okay, especially in the modern context where armies and countries in general do not have respect for civilian life in wars, as America set the precedent for that, obviously. Okay, so so that's the precedent. The precedent of war is that there is no respect for civilian lives now. Okay, so then how it basically means that the side that's going to uphold the moral imperative in war will also be the side that will likely lose the war. Okay, and so that's kind of the issue, and does it now come to a matter of transgress against them as they transgress against you, and so on. So I don't have the answer, okay, It's not an issue I have visited in many years. I'm only recalling it now because this is a bit of history I'm talking about. And I didn't obviously, at that time, have an answer either. Okay. And I felt that it was not significant for me to come up with an answer because I'm not in a position of authority, and I'm also not in a position of making decisions of this nature, and so it just simply does not concern me. And so that's the bottom line. And yeah, so that was my next step into my journey within Islam. And in the next video, I will talk more about my exposure to political Islam and to the movements within, the struggles in Arabia that Muslims, especially regarding Palestine, although I'm not going to talk much about Palestine, but how that affected me basically in my approach and my understanding and my visions and my goals within the religion. Thank you very much.